We hear about it all the time, right? Fortified borders, top-notch intelligence, like countries thinking they're untouchable.
Yeah.
And then October 7th, 2023 happened.
Really makes you think.
It does. Just how does something that massive, that shocking, how does it slip through the cracks?
A question a lot of people have been asking themselves since that day. The sheer brutality, the way it seemed to come out of nowhere, it's a lot to process.
It really is. And there's just so much information out there, which is, I guess, why we're doing this whole deep dive thing.
Exactly. We're here to break it down, make sense of it all, try to get some clarity.
Okay, so where do we even start? We've got firsthand accounts, military analysis, even like documents from Hamas themselves that are
Yes.
piecing together this insane puzzle
Right.
with incredibly high stakes.
And sometimes, even having all the pieces doesn't mean you see the picture right away. Take, for instance, this New York Times article. Did you know Israel actually had a copy of Hamas's battle plan? Like well over a year before it happened. They even had a name for it, called it the Jericho Wall document.
Wait, are you serious? They had the actual playbook, knew it was coming, and what? Ignored it.
Basically dismissed it. Thought it was too ambitious, too out there to be a credible threat. Like the intelligence analysts thought it was all just bluster.
Why?
Yeah, but here's the thing. Hamas wasn't bluffing. They followed that Jericho Wall document almost to the letter. The rockets, the drones used to disable border security, the sheer number of fighters that crossed it was all there, black and white. And it played out almost exactly as they'd planned.
That's chilling. I mean, you really have to wonder, what was going through their heads? Was this like a massive intel failure? Did they just completely underestimate Hamas, or was it something else entirely?
It's tough to say. Probably a combination of things, to be honest. There's this concept in intelligence analysis called the mirror image fallacy, where you basically assume your enemy thinks the same way you do.
Right.
So maybe there was an element of that. They saw this elaborate plan and just couldn't fathom that Hamas would actually try to pull it off.
Interesting. So they had the what, but they totally missed the how and the why. And, well, I guess the consequences of that, they were devastating. And that actually brings us to Hunted by Hamas. This book zeroes in on Kibbutz Be'eri,
Yeah.
which, as we know, was hit incredibly hard. Can you kind of walk us through what happened there?
So this book, it really puts you right there in the middle of the attack,
Yeah.
minute by minute. It's heart-wrenching. Imagine you're in this community, Kibbutz Be'eri, and all of a sudden, everything erupts. Racheli Benakat, the woman in charge of the emergency alerts, she's frantically sending out warnings. People are desperately trying to get messages out on their WhatsApp groups.
Oh, wow.
But the help just wasn't coming fast enough.
I mean, it's one thing to read the news, get the overview right, but to actually hear these firsthand accounts, to feel that sense of urgency in their words, it's completely
Oh,
different.
absolutely. And one of those harrowing things from the book is about the safe rooms.
Right, because a lot of homes in Israel have those, don't they? They're reinforced rooms meant to protect from rocket fire.
Exactly. And on October 7th, those safe rooms, they became the last line of defense. The book describes residents literally trying to hold those safe room doors shut as attackers are trying to force their way in from the outside.
Oh, God.
It's,
Oh.
it's terrifying. These spaces designed for safety becoming a battleground.
That's awful. And to make matters even worse, the book mentions that for hours the community couldn't really fight back. They had an armory, but
In all the chaos, they couldn't find the key.
oh no.
Can you imagine the frustrations,
man.
the desperation, knowing you have the means to defend yourself but not being able to get to them?
It's heartbreaking. But even in all of that horror, there were still these incredible stories of courage, of people risking everything to save others. Like the Clemenson brothers. Hunted by Hamas talks about them, three brothers from a nearby settlement, who basically put their lives on the line to rescue people trapped in Be'eri.
Yeah, for 16 hours straight, they went back and forth in their Jeep, pulling people out, making those split-second decisions about who they could save, who they had to leave behind.
Just incredible bravery.
And, it's interesting, the Clemensons, they came from a very different background than most in Be'eri.
Yeah.
More religious, more right-wing. But in that moment, all of that just, it fell away.
Right.
It's like a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, something like this can actually bring out the very best in humanity. The capacity for compassion, for unity, even in the face of this unimaginable tragedy.
Absolutely. And, as we delve deeper into all of this, it's crucial to look at all sides, right? Even the parts that are hard to hear, the parts we might want to turn away from. And that's where this Human Rights Watch report comes in. It's not an easy read, but it's essential.
It lays bare the brutal reality of what happened.
What do we need to understand about this report?
This report pulls no punches. We're talking executions, kidnappings, the use of civilians as human shields tactics, deliberately designed to inflict maximum terror, maximum suffering. It's stark, and it's deeply, deeply disturbing.
And it's important to remember this report doesn't just focus on Hamas, right? It also addresses the civilian casualties caused by Israeli forces in the fighting that followed. It's a reminder that this conflict is incredibly complex, with a long and painful history on both sides.
You're right. There's no black and white here, just shades of gray. And understanding that complexity, well, it's crucial if we want to have any hope of moving forward.
It's like that old saying, war is always worse than you imagine, even when you imagine the worst.
It's true.
And the thing is, it doesn't just end when the fighting stops, does it?
No, not at all.
There's the aftermath, this long, difficult road to healing for the individuals who live through it, but also for the region as a whole.
Exactly. The scars of October 7th run deep, and they'll be felt for generations. This wasn't just an event, it was. It ripped open all these old wounds and created new ones in the process. We have this NPR article that really captures that. It takes us 5 months after the attacks, and, well, they found was life for a lot of Israelis was still in limbo.
That's something you don't really hear about a lot, you know? The months, the years after a conflict like this, trying to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, it's the long tail of trauma, and
Yeah.
it can be really difficult to grasp. We're talking tens of thousands of people displaced from their homes, their lives completely upended, many living in temporary housing, their communities destroyed. There's this one story in the article about a man named Avador Schwartzman.
Okay.
He and his family were living in a trailer park because their kibbutz had been evacuated. His wife's parents were actually, they were killed in the attack. And so here they are trying to rebuild their lives, but surrounded by this unimaginable loss and this collective trauma.
Just the emotional toll of something like that. I mean, not only losing loved ones, but the fear, the uncertainty, right? Knowing that the world you thought you knew, it's just gone.
That's exactly what this NPR piece highlights, this profound psychological shift within Israel itself.
Yeah.
They use the phrase, hakoncepsia, the concept.
Interesting.
It refers to this set of deeply held assumptions that a lot of Israelis carried with them about life alongside Palestinians, about their own security, about the possibility of coexistence. And the October 7th attacks, they shattered all of that. People were left feeling incredibly vulnerable, deeply disillusioned, and honestly, very, very angry.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's like this rude awakening, this
Yeah.
loss of innocence almost. And like you said, it led to this surge of anger, a desire for retribution, which I'm sure further hardened attitudes on both sides. Did that impact the country as a whole?
Without a doubt. The article talks about how this shift in thinking played out everywhere you looked in the media, in political debates, even in casual, everyday conversations. Yeah. Initially, there was this wave of unity, this shared sense of grief and outrage. But as time went on, those deep divisions within Israeli society, they resurfaced, even intensified. There were all these heated debates about the government's handling of the war, the ongoing crisis in Gaza.
Right. And speaking of Gaza, I think it's important to kind of zoom out here. Consider the global ramifications of everything that happened. We have this PBS article that takes stock of things a year later, and it's really clear this isn't just an Israeli-Palestinian story anymore. The impact of these attacks, the reverberations, they were felt throughout the region and across the world.
Yeah, I mean, you had this massive humanitarian crisis unfolding, shifting alliances, rising tensions. It really was this ripple effect. The PBS article breaks it all down really well, looking at 4 key areas: Israel's response to the attacks, the situation in Gaza, Iran's role, and then the impact on U.S.-Israel relations.
Let's start with how Israel responded to the attacks, because they retaliated with significant force, right?
Right. They launched massive airstrikes and a ground offensive in Gaza, targeting Hamas infrastructure, weapons depots.
Right.
But it obviously ignited this huge firestorm of debate, both within Israel and internationally, about the proportionality of that response, the civilian casualty.
Because there always are civilian casualties in a situation like that.
Always. And the PBS article, it does a good job highlighting that inherent tension between legitimate security concerns, the need to defend your citizens, and the very real, devastating human cost of war. And remember that collective trauma we were just talking about?
Yeah.
It fed into this desire for decisive action, for retaliation, to make sure something like October 7th could never, ever happen again. But of course, there's always another side of that story. What about the people in Gaza?
Right, exactly.
The situation there, it was catastrophic. You had the constant bombardment, the displacement of civilians, this severe lack of basic necessities. The article cites reports from aid groups warning of famine, disease outbreaks, a complete collapse of infrastructure. Just a devastating humanitarian crisis unfolding in real time.
God.
Yeah.
It just never ends, does it? And then, of course, you have Iran always kind of lurking in the background. What role did they play in all of this?
Iran's role, it's complicated. And to be honest, it's often misunderstood. So they've been a longtime supporter of Hamas. They provide them with weapons, with funding, with training.
Right.
So initially, when Hamas was able to launch this sophisticated attack, it was seen as a victory for Iran, a sign that their strategy of supporting these proxy groups, it was working.
But there's always a but in geopolitics, isn't there?
Laughing, isn't there? But yeah, you see, the attack on Israel, it actually gave Israel the justification they needed to go after Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is another group that's backed by Iran.
Oh, wow.
So in a way, the attack on Israel backfired on Iran because it pulled them deeper into a conflict that maybe they weren't fully prepared for.
It's like this chain reaction. Every action creates these ripples, these unintended consequences.
That's a really good way to put it. And on top of all that, you have this other really unsettling thing emerge in the aftermath of the attacks. This wave of misinformation and denial, with people downplaying, even outright denying, the horrors of what had happened on October 7th.
Oh, right. Because it's one thing to, try to wrap your head around the complexities of the conflict, the history.
Right.
But then you have this added layer of people actively trying to control the narrative, to twist the truth, to fit their own agendas. It's almost like we can't even agree on a shared reality anymore.
And that's why it's more important than ever to be really critical consumers of information, to consider different perspectives, and to be very wary of these narratives that just seem too simplistic, too good to be true.
This PBS article, it really underscores how the events of October 7th fueled this really dangerous trend of misinformation and propaganda.
It's like we're in this house of mirrors, right?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out what's real, what's not, what's being spun.
It can feel that way.
And that kind of brings us to a whole other dimension of this whole thing,
Yeah.
The power of visual evidence,
Yeah.
the role it plays in conflicts, especially ones as complex as this.
Right, because images,
Yeah.
they can be incredibly powerful, visceral.
Yeah.
Immediate.
Definitely.
They can cut through all the noise, the rhetoric, show you the unvarnished truth in a way that words sometimes just can't.
A picture's worth 1,000 words and all that.
Exactly. But there's a flip side, isn't there?
Oh, for sure. It can be manipulated, taken out of context, used to shock, to horrify, sometimes for political gain.
And when it comes to October 7th, that's something that really comes up with this piece we have from Time magazine by Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. It talks about the footage, those really graphic images and videos compiled by the IDF after the attacks.
Right.
The decision to release that footage was, well, it was hugely controversial. I mean, some people were just horrified, but others argued that it was absolutely necessary to show the world the truth about what happened.
And it's interesting because Sonnenfeld, he really gets into the IDF's thought process there. And it's actually pretty fascinating. Like, they knew going in that the footage was brutal, that it was going to be hard to watch.
Right.
But they also felt very strongly that people needed to see it. Their argument was basically that the atrocities that happened on October 7th, that they were being downplayed, minimized, even denied in some circles.
Right.
They wanted to push back against that, to show the faces of the victims, the sheer brutality of it all, to leave no room for doubt.
So it was a strategic move on their part, aimed at shaping public opinion, maybe even drumming up international support.
You could definitely argue that. And the thing is, they were willing to risk the blowback, the accusations of exploiting people's pain, of sensationalizing tragedy, because to them, the stakes were that high.
Wow.
And, Sonnenfeld, he makes this really interesting comparison in the article. He draws this parallel to Emmett Till's mother.
Emmett Till, you're talking about the young black teenager who was lynched in Mississippi.
That's right. And his mother, she made the incredibly difficult decision to have an open casket at his funeral.
Oh, right.
Because she wanted the world to see what had been done to her son, just how brutally he'd been murdered.
And those photos, as horrifying as they were, they really did galvanize the civil rights movement.
They did.
Yeah.
because those images, as awful as they were to look at, they forced people to confront the reality of what was happening,
Yeah.
the inhumanity of it. And it seems like that was what the IDF was hoping for here, that by releasing this footage, no matter how difficult it was to watch, that it would kind of shock people awake.
Into action,
Yeah,
right.
it's a shame.
It's such a complicated issue, isn't it? I mean, and I don't envy anyone having to make that decision.
Yeah, absolutely not. And it's something that's still being debated today. Like, when is it right to show these kinds of images? When do they actually serve a purpose? And when do they cross a line? There's no easy answer, but it is a conversation we need to be having.
We really do. Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? The lead up to the attacks, the military strategy, the devastating human cost, the political fallout. We even talked about the ethical dilemmas that arise from something like this.
It's a lot.
It really is. And I have to say, I'm just an observer here, and it's overwhelming, honestly. I can't even imagine what it must be like for the people who actually live through it, who are still dealing with the consequences.
It's true. It's incredibly complex, and there are no simple answers. But if there's one thing I hope you take away from this deep dive, from everything we've discussed today, it's that understanding events like October 7th, it requires us to look at them from multiple perspectives, even, and maybe especially, when those perspectives make us uncomfortable or even challenge our own beliefs.
It's about being open to different perspectives, to nuance, even when it's hard.
Exactly.
And I think, in a way, maybe that's the biggest challenge of all, staying informed, staying engaged with the world, but also staying critical, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information, misinformation, you name it.
It's a lifelong process. This conversation, it's just one piece of it. But every piece of knowledge, every new perspective we gain, it brings us a little bit closer to understanding the world around us and hopefully to building a better future.